Hello. Me reflecting on this album and my overall Eminem hyperfixation that comes and goes throughout the years. Overall, I think it's a good piece of continuing of his performance art. I think that because of its nature, I think part of its nature is to prove how sort of outdated and almost toothless the Slim Shady persona has become. And obviously, so that's a little bit why we have so much of the same jokes over and over again, and they seem kind of like outdated, and they're actually like constantly being undercut and all of that. But still present, because I do think that in a lot of ways, well, I think Slim Shady is one, he's sort of like this Jungian shadow, which, in case you don't know, it's this depth psychology, and Jung was a sort of psychoanalyst, and he's also like a wild guy, man about town, esotericist as well, really into archetypes, really into this idea that like there's this collective subconscious that we're all connected to, and it has all these inherent sort of different characters in it called archetypes that are like the trickster or the young maiden or the crone or all of that, and they show up in different pockets because we're tapping into the same like sort of water underneath. And there's this idea of the Jungian shadow, which I got really interested in, and Women Who Run with Wolves is like a great book on that, of the Jungian analysis of fairy tales, and then also like myths and how they specifically relate to the struggle of like feminine parts of the soul, even though the gendered language isn't super awesome. I think it's still helpful in terms of pointing us out towards that. So anyway, so I think that in a lot of ways, part of what attracted to me to, really doing a deep dive in Eminem, I got really, really obsessed with his album, The Marshall Mathers LP2, which came out in about 2013, which was when I was like going through a really just tough time in terms of having a lot of like really gross Saturn transits in terms of astrology, and like having really bad PMDD, like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which I later in 2018 have been able to drastically minimize after having to cope with it for like 20 years by cutting out gluten. That's a separate issue. But yeah, it was just like really depressed after college and feeling like very stuck, and classic millennial, struggles, and all of that. So part of what helped me through that period in my life was sort of tapping into that, because in a way it's like similar to blues and similar to like some country and folk and stuff. In a way, rap is kind of music for hard times, helps you process anger, helps you process depression, and it also gives you like this linchpin to stick to. And I really vibe much more with like this kind of hyper verbal rap as opposed to like it's not as beat focused as I would say like Jay-Z is or something. So hold on, so I didn't gravitate as much towards that, but yeah, it's kind of really hyper verbal rap. I mean, like Notorious B.I.G. is very incredible wordplay. There's a couple other rappers I like, but mainly I really like Eminem, and part of what I like about him is always has been his like sort of meta awareness. And I think there's also strengths and also obvious downsides in associating yourself or in confronting or letting the Jungian shadow kind of possess you. The Jungian shadow as this idea of like everything that we're repressing, like our really dark intrusive thoughts, our horror about like the patriarchy, our like wild, uncivilized sort of, neuroses about sex and all of that, and death and fascinations and everything that we kind of like don't sort of associate, or has been marginalized or has been shunted away kind of by the collective consciousness. It's a lot of female rage, a lot of oppression, rage, and all of that is right there. And so I think that's part of why, in a way, these people who become these magnets become these hyper famous people who are artists tapping into these collective energies, and that's why they resonate with so many people. And he said, like, over and over again that he used rap to, escape his horrific circumstances of growing up extremely impoverished in Detroit, and, having so much history of, like, family mental illness and abuse and addiction and all of that. And he eventually overcame his addiction after several very close calls. One specific, near death, but sort of death and then rebirth experience, where he overdosed. I think it was 2008, maybe. And he's been sober for 16 years since then. And but he's still kind of, he has to reckon with this idea of what happens when you let this sort of Jungian shadow, and he admits it's like a Faustian bargain, especially in that song called My Darling, which is all about that. And he talks about it a lot. Like, he actually came out, he first was trying to make it as a rapper, by doing like uplifting rap. And he had this EP called Infinite, which was kind of in this style of Nas, and it's actually, I like it. I like the softer Eminem stuff too, the inspirational stuff. But he couldn't move the needle on it, so he just really went into this extreme, like, he calls shock rap with Doc. This extreme horrorcore and extreme, like, just saying, all these things that he says, I'm joking about things that you would only mention in your living room, saying all these, like, sort of understood to not be said things in society. And that's how he really broke through. And he, even from his beginning, he always had this, like, meta-consciousness of, like, am I the bad person for saying it when everyone's saying this, or everyone's thinking this, or this, I'm just picking up and reflecting this cultural milieu, and does that absolve him of responsibility, or does that not? He really grapples with that a lot in, like, Sing for the Moment, which is also one of my favorite songs, which samples Aerosmith, and it's all about words. I talked a little bit about it before, too, about, like, how culpable is he for how people respond to his art. He says, words can alter moods and talk to you, but can it load a gun up for you and cock it too? Because if it can, just tell the judge it's my fault and I'll get sued. So he's talking about that, and he's always, even, what song is that? Since he grew up in such extreme poverty and extreme gun violence in Detroit, I never saw it happening throughout his whole life. He's always commented on, like, this idea of gun violence becoming much more widespread in society, and people only really caring about it or thinking it's a problem if it, it's not a problem if it happens. It's been happening in the projects forever, but when it starts to happen to white people, then people sort of care, but actually they don't really care, because we aren't doing anything about it. But anyway, so that's sort of where I'm coming from, and about that. And also, it was, like, interesting to me about how I don't really think that I'm gonna be going back and listening to this Death of Slim Shady too much, versus I do listen to, well, I haven't listened to it in a while, but I do really go back and listen to MMOP2 again sometimes.